The crater smelled like sulfur and death. Private First Class Terrance Womack pressed his face against the black volcanic sand and tried to make himself small. His rifle was empty. His last magazine had been spent 15 minutes ago on the 3 Japanese soldiers who had tried to rush their position from the north. He had killed 2 of them. The third had taken a bayonet through the chest from Corporal Higgins before he could reach the crater rim. Now Higgins was dead too, his body lying 3 feet away with a mortar fragment embedded in his throat. They had started the morning with 11 men. They were down to 5. No radio, no ammunition, no hope of reinforcement. The Japanese knew exactly where they were, and somewhere in the maze of tunnels beneath Iwo Jima, a counterattack was being organized that would wipe them from the face of the earth. Sergeant Frank Holloway crawled to the edge of the crater and scanned the volcanic wasteland through cracked binoculars. What he saw made his stomach turn to ice. Movement. Lots of movement. Japanese infantry were massing in a trench line 200 yards to the east. He counted at least 40, maybe more. They were fixing bayonets. They were preparing to charge. 5 Marines. 0 ammunition. 40 screaming Japanese soldiers with steel and rage and the absolute intention of dying for their emperor if they could take Americans with them. Holloway was about to die. He had accepted this. What he could not accept was dying without a fight. That's when he saw it. 15 feet from the crater rim, half buried in the black sand, sat the twisted remains of a Japanese anti-aircraft position. A direct hit from naval gunfire had destroyed the sandbag revetment and killed the crew. Bodies in scorched uniforms lay scattered around the site. But the weapon itself, a triple-barreled Type 96-25 Meme autocannon, was still intact. The barrels were pointing skyward at a useless angle. The ammunition boxes stacked beside it were sealed and untouched. The Japanese called it the Dragon. 3 barrels that breathed fire at 450 rounds per minute. Each shell was designed to shred American aircraft, packed with high explosives that fragmented on impact. It was one of the most effective anti-aircraft weapons in the Pacific, responsible for countless American pilots burning to death in their cockpits. Now it sat abandoned, pointed at empty sky, while 40 Japanese soldiers prepared to overrun the position it had been built to defend. Holloway made his decision in the time it takes a heart to beat twice. "Get to that gun," he ordered. "Everyone. Now." Private Martinez looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Sarge, that's a Jap gun. We don't know how to operate it. We don't even know if it works. Then we're about to learn. Move." The 5 survivors sprinted from the crater to the destroyed gun position. Japanese rifle fire cracked around them, kicking up puffs of volcanic sand. Martinez took a round through the shoulder and kept running. They slid into the position behind the bodies of the dead Japanese gun crew, and Holloway got his first close look at the weapon that would either save them or kill them. The Type 96 was a monster. 3 25 Meme barrels arranged in a triangular configuration, fed by 15 round box magazines that the crew had to change by hand. The entire assembly was mounted on a wheeled carriage that could be traversed and elevated through a system of hand cranks. It was air-cooled, which meant sustained fire would overheat the barrels until they warped or, worse, cooked off rounds prematurely. But the biggest problem was immediately obvious. The gun was designed to shoot at aircraft. The elevation mechanism was set for high-angle fire. When Holloway grabbed the traverse wheel and tried to lower the barrels toward the approaching infantry, they stopped at about 30 degrees above horizontal. The gun couldn't aim at ground targets. It was physically designed to point at the sky. The Japanese were 200 yards away and closing. "The depression gears," Private Kowalski said suddenly. He was a farm kid from Wisconsin who had worked on machinery his entire life. "There's a limiting bolt. They install it to prevent the crew from accidentally firing into their own fortifications. Remove the bolt, the barrels will drop lower." Holloway stared at him. "You're sure? I worked on combine harvesters. Same principle. Find the bolt, remove it. Problem solved." They didn't have tools. They had knives, a bayonet, and 60 seconds before the Japanese charge reached effective rifle range, Kowalski jammed the bayonet into the elevation mechanism and started prying at the machinery with the desperation of a man who knew death was counting down behind him. Metal squealed. Something cracked. The bayonet blade snapped in half, but the limiting bolt popped free and clattered into the volcanic sand. Holloway grabbed the elevation wheel and cranked. The 3 barrels dropped. 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 40 degrees below horizontal. They were now pointing directly at the approaching Japanese infantry. 150 yards. The enemy officers were blowing whistles. The charge was beginning. Load the magazines, Holloway ordered. Every box you can find. Stack them next to me. The Japanese ammunition boxes were labeled in characters none of them could read, but the contents were universal. 15-round clips packed with 25 min high-explosive shells. Martinez, bleeding freely from his shoulder wound, tore open boxes and passed magazines to Kowalski, who figured out the loading mechanism by pure intuition. The magazine slotted into place with a satisfying click. Kowalski worked the charging handles on all 3 barrels. The weapon was ready. 100 yards. The Japanese were screaming now. That sound, that horrible sound that had haunted American nightmares across the Pacific. The Banzai scream, the death song of men who had already said goodbye to their families. Holloway didn't know where the trigger was. The Japanese controls were completely foreign. He found a pedal on the floor of the gun platform and pressed it. Nothing happened. 90 yards. He could see their faces now. Young men, terrified men, men who were running toward death because their emperor had told them to. He found a lever on the left side of the mounting and pulled. The dragon breathed. The triple barrels erupted simultaneously with a sound unlike anything the Americans had ever heard. It wasn't the thump of the 37 Mini or the pop of the Bofors or the roar of the Quad 50. It was a mechanical snarl, 3 overlapping detonations that blurred together into a continuous ripping noise. Brrrt! The sound of canvas being torn by a machine. The effect on the charging infantry was immediate and catastrophic. Each 25 EMOR shell was designed to destroy aircraft engines. When those shells struck human bodies, the destruction was absolute. The high-explosive warheads detonated on impact, creating fragmentation patterns that shredded everything within a 5-foot radius. The first burst killed 8 men instantly. The second burst killed 6 more. The survivors didn't scatter. They simply ceased to exist as the triple-barreled monster swept across the charge like a scythe through wheat. Holloway held the firing lever down. The magazines emptied in seconds. Kowalski slammed fresh magazines into place with hands that were moving faster than his brain could think. Martinez, despite his wound, was tearing open ammunition boxes and feeding the supply line. The Japanese charge collapsed. The survivors dove for cover behind the bodies of their fallen comrades. But there was no cover from a weapon that could disintegrate a human body with a single shell. The officers tried to rally their men. Holloway saw a lieutenant standing in the open, waving his sword, screaming orders. He traversed the gun slightly and gave the officer a 2-second burst. The lieutenant and the 3 men standing near him vanished in a cloud of red mist and black sand. 45 seconds. That was how long the engagement lasted. In that time, the Type 96 had fired over 200 rounds. The charging infantry had been reduced from 40 men to a handful of wounded survivors crawling back toward their own lines. But they weren't done. The Japanese responded to the disaster with the same tactic they always used when confronted with an unexpected threat. They called for mortar fire. The first rounds landed long, detonating harmlessly behind the gun position. The second salvo was closer. The third walked directly across the crater, where the Marines had been hiding minutes earlier. If they had stayed in that position, they would be dead. Holloway knew the mortars would find them eventually. The Japanese observers were adjusting fire, walking the explosions toward the gun position. He had maybe 2 minutes before a round dropped directly onto the triple dragon and ended everything. He made another decision that violated every tactical principle he had ever been taught. Instead of keeping his head down and waiting for the bombardment to end, he started looking for the mortar teams. "Where's the smoke coming from?" he shouted. "Anyone see the launch signature?" Martinez pointed with his good arm. "There, 2 o'clock. Behind that rocky outcrop." Holloway traversed the gun. The outcrop was 400 yards away, at the extreme edge of the weapon's effective range. The Type 96 wasn't designed for precision fire at that distance. It was designed to fill a volume of sky with explosions and let probability do the killing. But Holloway didn't need precision. He needed suppression. He opened fire. The triple barrels pumped shells toward the outcrop in a continuous stream. Explosions blossomed across the rocky face, sending fragments in all directions. He couldn't see the mortar teams. He didn't need to see them. He just needed to make their position untenable. The mortar fire stopped. Either the crews were dead, or they had abandoned their positions to escape the incoming fire. Either way, the immediate threat was eliminated. And then Holloway noticed the barrels. They were glowing. The sustained fire had heated the air-cooled weapon past its design limits. The blued steel was turning a dull red, visible even in the harsh Pacific sunlight. Steam was rising from the cooling fins. The weapon was cooking itself from the inside. "Sarge, we need to stop firing," Kowalski warned. "Those barrels are about to go." "One more target," Holloway said. He had spotted something through the smoke, a concrete bunker, half concealed by volcanic rock, with a firing slit pointing directly at the American landing zones to the south. The bunker had been silent throughout the engagement, its crew probably observing and waiting. If that position remained operational, it would slaughter Marines crossing the beach for days. The range was close, maybe 200 yards. The angle was awkward. The barrels were overheating. Everything about this shot was wrong. Holloway lined up the triple muzzles on the bunker's firing slit and pressed the firing lever. He didn't just fire. He hammered. He put round after round into the same spot, walking the impacts across the concrete face of the fortification. This was the technique that no training manual had ever described, that no weapon designer had ever intended. He was using an anti-aircraft gun as a battering ram, concentrating fire on a single point until the structure itself failed. The 25 mm shells weren't designed to penetrate concrete, but they didn't need to. Each explosion chipped away at the surface. Each impact created fractures that the next round exploited. The firing slit, designed to be nearly impervious to small arms fire, began to crumble under the sustained assault. The barrels were bright orange now. The heat was so intense that the paint on the gun shield was blistering and peeling. Kowalski had stopped loading and was backing away from the weapon, convinced it was about to explode. Holloway held the lever down. The bunker collapsed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a grinding subsidence as the structural integrity finally gave way. The firing slit disappeared into a pile of rubble. Whatever crew had been inside was buried under tons of volcanic rock and shattered concrete. Holloway released the firing lever. The dragon fell silent. For a long moment, nobody moved. The barrels continued to glow, ticking and pinging as the superheated metal began to cool. Smoke rose from the mechanism in lazy spirals. The weapon had done everything that physics said it shouldn't do. It had aimed at targets it was never designed to engage. It had survived sustained fire that should have destroyed it. It had turned a massacre into a victory. The 5 Marines looked at each other across the destroyed gun position. Martinez was pale from blood loss. Kowalski's hands were burned from handling hot ammunition. Private Jenkins, who hadn't spoken a word during the entire engagement, was weeping silently with relief. They had started the morning with 11 men. No ammunition, and no hope. They were ending it with 5 men, a destroyed enemy weapon, and an entire sector secured. When the relief column finally reached their position 4 hours later, the officer in charge stopped and stared at the scene. Dead Japanese soldiers carpeted the volcanic slope. The collapsed bunker smoked in the distance, and in the center of the destruction sat 5 exhausted Marines beside a triple-barreled Japanese cannon with barrels warped beyond any possible repair. "What the hell happened here?" the officer asked. Holloway looked at the dragon, then at the bodies, then at his surviving men. "We ran out of American ammunition," he said simply, "so we used theirs." The Type 96 was photographed, documented, and eventually shipped back to the United States for technical analysis. The intelligence officers were fascinated by the modifications the Marines had made, the depression gear removal, the improvised loading procedures. the hammering technique that had turned an anti-aircraft weapon into a bunker buster. They wrote reports about Japanese engineering. They analyzed the ammunition. They studied the metallurgy of the barrels. They completely missed the point. The weapon hadn't saved those Marines. The weapon was just metal and explosives. What saved them was the refusal to die quietly. What saved them was the willingness to learn enemy technology in 60 seconds flat. What saved them was the understanding that in combat, the only useless weapon is the one you don't use. Sergeant Frank Holloway received the Navy Cross for his actions on Iwo Jima. The citation mentioned his leadership and bravery under fire. It did not mention that he had turned the Emperor's own dragon against his troops. It did not mention the poetic justice of Japanese shells killing Japanese soldiers from a Japanese gun operated by Americans who had never been trained to use it. Some stories are too strange for official records. Some victories are too ironic for military citations. But the Marines who survived that crater remembered. They called it the traitor gun for the rest of their lives. They told the story to their children and grandchildren. They remembered the sound, that tearing burst that meant death for the enemy and salvation for them. They remembered that when everything failed, when ammunition ran out and hope disappeared, a weapon designed to kill them became the weapon that saved them. If Holloway's story of turning enemy engineering into American victory hit you the way it hit me, smash that like button right now. Every like tells the algorithm that stories of impossible improvisation deserve to be told. If you're not subscribed, now is the time, because next week we're uncovering another captured weapon that changed the course of a battle. Drop a comment and answer honestly. If you were trapped with no ammunition and an enemy gun you had never seen before, would you have tried to figure it out or accepted your fate? I want to know. I'll see you in the next one.